What if I told you that one of the absolute biggest, most anticipated crypto laws in history just quietly turned 1 year old? Well, today we have a really fascinating explainer lined up for you. We're going to unpack the Genius Act. This was a piece of legislation that literally had the entire financial world holding its breath. But today, we're cutting straight through the noise. We're looking directly at the data, and we're explaining what exactly happened after the ink finally dried on this monumental law.
But despite all those massive screaming headlines from a year ago, the single biggest question still really hasn't been answered. And that brings us to the absolute core of our exploration today. Did the Genius Act actually fix anything? I mean, think back to when this was passed, right? Supporters were calling it the definitive future of digital finance. On the flip side, critics were loudly warning that it would completely stifle and just, slow down innovation. But here we are, 1 year later, and the actual results tell a much more interesting, nuanced story than either side predicted.
All right, Section 1, 1 year later, the state of crypto. To really grasp what happened, we've got to set the scene. We have to remember exactly what the industry looked like right before this legislation was passed. This was the before era. And honestly, it was, in a lot of ways, the Wild West. Stablecoins were operating under this heavy, heavy cloud of uncertainty. Companies were constantly bumping into totally inconsistent regulations, mostly depending on where they were trying to do business. And because of this, the massive traditional financial institutions, they remained incredibly cautious. They were just standing on the sidelines watching. Meanwhile, governments were locked in these endless circular debates about oversight. So it makes sense why, when the Genius Act finally arrived, everyone believed it was going to change absolutely everything, pretty much overnight.
Moving on to Section 2, why the law mattered, setting the stakes.
To truly understand the legislation itself, we have to understand what it was primarily targeting, and that target was stablecoins. Now, these are digital assets, sure, but their utility is absolutely massive for modern institutional finance. We're talking about the fundamental plumbing of the future economy here. Faster payments, seamless cross-border settlements, driving the adoption of a digital dollar, and building a completely new, highly efficient payment infrastructure. They had simply become way too important for regulators to ignore. So the crucial point is really understanding what the government was actually trying to achieve here. They wanted consumer protection, overarching financial stability, crystal clear transparency regarding the reserves backing these coins, strict compliance standards, and ultimately they wanted market confidence. And when you examine these specific goals, you realize something pretty profound. The government wasn't actually trying to fix the technology. The technology worked. The real challenge they were trying to solve, the missing piece of the puzzle, was trust.
Which brings us to Section 3, expectation versus reality, the big reveal.
The overarching expectation in the market was super simple: immediate transformation. The whole narrative was that the very second regulatory clarity was achieved, the floodgates would just burst open. Traditional finance would pour in instantly, and crypto would basically transform overnight. But as the source material for this explainer clearly points out, regulation simply doesn't change an entire industry overnight. It just doesn't happen that way.
The reality we ended up with is actually a stark split. On one hand, yes, we absolutely got greater regulatory clarity, and we are for sure seeing way more serious institutional discussions taking place. Compliance standards have undeniably increased across the board, and we have much stronger reserve transparency, which gives traditional finance a lot more confidence. But, on the other hand, what remains stubbornly unchanged? Well, a ton of projects are still deeply struggling with actual user adoption, proper user education, overcoming that wild market volatility, and most importantly, basic consumer trust.
Section 4, the trust framework. And honestly, this is the big lesson.
I absolutely love this quote from our source material because it perfectly summarizes the reality of the situation. It says, regulation builds frameworks, trust builds markets. The Genius Act did exactly what it was supposed to do, right? It built the foundation. But a foundation is just an empty concrete slab until somebody actually builds a house on it. Regulation alone never creates growth. It merely creates the opportunity for growth.
True adoption depends on entirely different factors. It depends on trust, reputation, relentless user education, building genuinely strong products, and of course, long-term execution. At the end of the day, businesses are what create growth. And if you look at the landscape out there today, the companies that are successfully attracting investors aren't just the ones that are legally compliant. No, they're the ones that are recognizable, highly visible, and repeatedly seen everywhere across the media.
Let's jump into Section 5, the Smart Company Playbook. Time for some actionable strategy.
So how do you actually build that kind of visibility?
Well, successful companies aren't just sitting back relying on the Genius Act to do their marketing for them. Instead, they're actively executing a playbook. They're focusing on consistent public relations, they're getting their founders highly visible in the public eye, they're completely dominating their search presence, establishing real thought leadership, maintaining radical transparency, and actively building up their media credibility. Basically, they are proactively building their reputation while the regulatory landscape just continues to slowly evolve in the background.
And they're doing this because the winners know a fundamental secret of business: trust compounds. Literally, just like interest in a bank account, visibility compounds over time, recognition compounds, authority compounds. The really smart brands out there, they aren't waiting around for the government to just hand them credibility. They're out there earning it day by day, article by article, interview by interview.
As we zoom out and look at the big picture of what the Genius Act has actually taught us, we see something that history has shown us time and time again. Following major new regulations in literally any financial sector, the companies that end up surviving and dominating, they usually aren't the loudest ones in the room. They aren't the ones making the absolute craziest promises on social media. They are simply the ones that become the most trusted by the public and by the institutions.
So listen, if you take absolutely nothing else away from this explainer today, I really want you to remember this powerful realization. The Genius Act didn't magically transform crypto, but it started building a vital foundation. Compliance merely opens the door. Credibility determines who actually gets to walk through it. And that right there, that is the fundamental difference between just surviving in this industry and actually winning.
Which leaves us with one final, really proactive thought. If you are building a crypto, fintech, or financial brand today, please do not make the mistake of waiting for regulation alone to build your trust for you. You have to take control of your own narrative. I highly encourage you to explore Web3 Newswire to discover how strategic PR can help you increase your visibility, dramatically strengthen your credibility, and ensure you stay relevant and trusted through absolutely every market cycle. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. The Genius Act built the framework for sure, but as we look ahead to year 2, the real question is this: are you building a product that is merely compliant, or are you building a brand that the market actually trusts?
Subscribe and visit Web3 Newswire for visibility and credibility of your Web3 projects.